Hi, this is Mark Stein of Vanilla Fudge, and you just keep me hanging on. Celebrating 20 years of retrospectives with John Broughton on 3SER, KC Radio.
Just want to just cover a little bit of history first, if that's okay. Can you tell us about the Pigeons and how it all evolved into what became Vanilla Fudge?
Well, basically, the Pigeons was really the residue of a top 40 band that I was in when I was a wee lad of probably about 18, and the band was called Rick Martin and the Showmen. And, we played all the clubs on the west side of New York, places like the Wagon Wheel and the Headliner and the Peppermint Lounge. And, the Peppermint Lounge was like places like Joey D and the Starlighters used to play, and even Jimi Hendrix, he used to play there with the Starlighters band and jam there from time to time, probably, around 1966. Mm-hmm. And, that was like a top 40 band, as I said, and we toured up and down the East Coast, and it wasn't until I went and, saw a band called the Young Rascals, who were just about to break, and they kind of really blew my mind with the white soul music they were doing, and that kind of motivated us to go in that direction. And Tim Bogert was in Rick Martin and the Showmen with me, and we left the band, and then we formed a band called the Pigeons, and the band was with myself, Tim Bogert, and Vinnie Martell, and Joey Brennan, who was the original drummer. And the Pigeons, we played around New Jersey and the New York area for a while, and eventually we became the Vanilla Fudge, and that kind of came about because we after seeing what the Rascals were doing, we also went to see a band called the Vagrants out in Long Island, who were doing this production rock, it was called, slowing down songs, and actually that was the band that kind of totally blew my mind, and that's what I wanted to do. We wanted to go forward and do something more important than just playing top 40 songs as we were doing. Uh-huh. But the Pigeons, we had a really good following along the East Coast, and we used to play up in Newport, Rhode Island, where we had a big following as well, and nobody could ever dance to our music because we started doing what became the first Vanilla Fudge album. We started doing versions of You Keep Me Hanging On and Eleanor Rigby and all those songs that eventually became the famous arrangements. And basically that's what the Pigeons was.
Looking back now, how important do you regard those days as the Pigeons in terms of your grounding as a musician?
Well, it was very important because, we used to play so many shows. We used to play maybe 6 nights a week, sometimes 7 nights a week. Sometimes we'd play, 6 shows a night, so that would be like 36 shows a week. So what it did is it really, got my chops together, got everybody's chops together because we played so much. And plus just being out in the streets and learning a lot about life at that young age, had a lot to do with what happened going forward.
Can you recall the origins of the Vanilla Fudge name?
Well, when Atlantic took an interest, in signing the band, actually we went in and with Shadow Morton, our manager Phil Basile, got us basically an audition with the famous producer Shadow Morton, the late '60s fame. Mm-hmm. I recall going down to the studio, and we went out and recorded some tracks, and then eventually Atlantic really loved it, wanted to sign us, but they said we got to come up with a new name. So while we were rehearsing at the Action House, which was in the late '60s, that was our manager's club, Phil Basile. There was a girl from a band called the Unspoken Word. It was a New York band. Yep. And we were saying, we're looking for a new name, and we've been tossing a bunch of things around. So basically, she said, why don't you call yourselves the Vanilla Fudge? I said, why is that? Because my grandfather used to call me that when I was a little kid because I love Vanilla Fudge ice cream so much. I mean, that's really what the true story is.
Simple as that.
There was always stories about white guys doing black music, white soul, and it actually made sense. But that's the naive, innocent story of why we got that name.
When you listen back on those early recordings now, is it hard to comprehend that the young man on those records is you? Does it seem like a whole other time and place now?
Well, when I look back, I'm really proud of some of the things I did, and and then when I listen to it, I wish maybe we could have done things a little bit differently. Maybe we could have recorded things a little better. But hindsight is 20/20 when you look back. But Again, I am proud of some of the things. I know You Keep Me Hanging On probably stands up as one of the rock classics even today.
Sure. You remember how the arrangement of that song came together?
I'm sorry?
Remember how the arrangement for You Keep Me Hanging On came to be?
Yeah, actually, I recall it had to be about 1966 or 67. Tim Bogert and myself, we were sitting in a car in the wintertime. It was outside on Broadway in New York City in Manhattan in front of a discotheque called the Cheetah. And I can remember this very vividly. We had the radio blast, and then the Supremes version of You Keep Me Hanging On came on. It was like, set me free, why don't you, baby? Like really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at Timmy, I'm saying, this almost sounds like it's like a 45 being played on 78. But this song, I think, if we slow this thing down, I mean, it just seems like it would be so soulful to do it. So we kind of looked at each other and with a little smile on our face. And I remember we were playing at a club called Anganos, I believe, in New York City at the time. And in the afternoons, we would go in and just start putting some arrangements together. Vinnie Martel had this incredible, like raga-like rock lick on his guitar, which eventually became the intro.
Mm-hmm.
Guitar intro to You Keep Me Hanging On, which I read somewhere in Guitar Player magazine. I think it's one of the top 10 classic rock licks of all time it became. And I just kind of had the idea to slow it down, and I wanted to take the theme of the melody of Set Me Free, Why Don't You, Babe, and that's the melody that you'll hear on that eerie kind of organ sound that I developed on there.
That's right.
It's really the melody of the song slowed down. And it just all came together with some symphonic arrangements from Tim and Carmine, and I guess it was just something that was meant to happen.
Certainly had other people's songs. What for you was the essential ingredient in making a successful arrangement?
Well, I think the main thing in redoing somebody else's songs, I think number one is maintaining the integrity of the song, and I believe if you're going to do somebody else's song, I think you should do it in a fresh way, because anybody can just do it exactly the same way. What's the point of doing it?
Sure. Did you have a criteria in those days for choosing songs to cover?
Well, basically, the criteria was pretty simple. I mean, everybody in the band really had to love the song. I mean, it's like we'd sit around and say, well, we really want to do this tune, and if it really turned everybody on, and that was the basic motivation for rearranging the song.
Looking back on those days, how do you think you coped personally with all the notoriety and stardom that came?
I mean, when we first started to become successful, how do we handle all the fame and everything?
Yeah.
It wasn't easy. I remember all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I recall being in the studio with our producer, and I think the first album came out in August of 1967.
Yep.
And a short time after, before you knew it, they were playing, the whole side of the record on the West Coast. And at the time, that was totally unheard of, except for the Beatles. So it was all the underground radio at the time on the West Coast that, started playing, I think it was like 33 minutes without a commercial. And before you knew it, we were being booked to open for the Mamas and the Papas at the Portland Coliseum, a bunch of wet-behind-the-ear kids from New York that, they really weren't ready for first fame. It's really a difficult thing to handle.
Yeah.
I mean, I recall hearing Barry Gibb, from your homeland, from the Bee Gees, talking about how first fame is really difficult because it could really lead to a very quick explosion of egos when you're that age. So it's a pretty tough thing to handle.
How did the guys within the band get along? Were relationships pretty good? Were you a tight unit?
Well, in the beginning, we were like a family. I mean, everybody really, we had our misgivings here and there like everybody else, but we were a very tight family. We all were aligned towards one cause, and that was to, be the best we could be and to be a, really successful band. I remember we used to ride around and kid around and act like we were rock stars long before it ever happened. It's kind of like, you just kind of like visualize something to make it happen, and sometimes, a lot of times it will happen. And then when it really happened, it was just like a dream coming true. But, in the beginning, the band, again, was like a family, but unfortunately, as time went on, that close-knit tie started to disintegrate, and the guys had different musical things that they want to achieve, and one thing led to another, and eventually led to the breakup of the band probably about 4 years subsequent to that first album.
What about the record company? Did they pretty much give you a free hand to do what you like with your recordings, or did they put a lot of pressure on to go in a certain direction?
Well, that's really an interesting question. Actually, I recall that they gave us complete and total freedom. Maybe ultimately that may have hurt us in the end, because if you recall a record called The Beat Goes On, which was our second album release, and basically that was like a really ambitious project that our producer Shadow wanted to accomplish, and it was just kind of like a chronology of music through the centuries, and in the mind it sounded like it would have been a terrific thing to do, but when it came out on record, frankly, I'm being really honest, it was a very pretentious sounding record, and we had so much momentum going after that first album, and we put that on the market, and basically really stopped a lot of our momentum, and disappointed a lot of our fans out there. And actually it took a couple of albums to get some of that confidence back.
What was the band's attitude to live performance back in those days? Were you very particular about your live shows and maintaining a quality of performance there?
No, absolutely. I mean, playing live shows was like the number one prideful thing with us, because Vanilla Fudge, we were really known for our live performances. When we toured the States and Europe, probably back in '68 and '69, we opened for Jimi Hendrix. That was like one of the first major tours of two rock bands back then, and that was just an incredible tour of the whole Southwest. And at the time we were really at our peak, and we'd come on just at the right time. And after I think the Soft Machine, and I forgot the other act that was on the bill, but we'd come on just at the right time when people were just ready to be rocked out. And by the time Jimmy came on, he always played a great show, but I think that people kind of like got entertained out by that time. But we were at our peak at that time, and we also toured with Led Zeppelin. I don't know how many people know that out there, but Led Zeppelin actually opened for us. The first time they toured the United States, they opened for Vanilla Fudge the first and second time. And but playing the live shows was like the epitome for us. So if anybody wants to check out the Vanilla Fudge website, vanillafudge.com, you can see comments by Robert Plant and John Paul Jones about what they thought about Vanilla Fudge, and we actually were a pretty strong influence on them as well, which I found very gratifying.
What about for yourself when the band split? Did you have a firm idea about what you wanted to do with the next phase of your career?
Jimmy Galuzzi and Sal D'Onofrio, but that never really felt right to me. I mean, after about a month of rehearsals, I just felt like I didn't want to go on with it, because it wasn't the original band, and I really didn't want to go out touring under the Vanilla Fudge banner if it wasn't the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, what that band became was a band called Boomerang. It was that rhythm section, Jimmy Galuzzi and Sal D'Onofrio, myself, and then we came upon a 15-year-old really exciting guitar player by the name of Ricky Ramirez, and I formed a band called Boomerang from that. And actually that band was really influenced by a lot of the Zeppelin things that were going on and a lot of the other rock bands at the time.
Mm-hmm. Outside of Vanilla Fudge, would that be one of your most enjoyable musical experiences?
I'm sorry?
Outside of Vanilla Fudge, would that be one of your most enjoyable musical times with Boomerang?
I think, probably one of the most enjoyable musical things that I've done after Vanilla Fudge was when I recorded and toured with Dave Mason, of Traffic fame and solo fame. So in the late 70s, I toured with Dave and his band and recorded a couple of albums with them, and we toured around the world. And we had a great time. We had some great bands, and we developed a really close friendship and a great bond, and that was probably the most fun that I think I ever had after Vanilla Fudge. And of course, in '77, I toured with Alice Cooper right down in your homeland there in Australia, which was a very exciting tour. It was the Welcome to My Nightmare tour, and and I recall it was probably the biggest grossing tour of all time, back in '77. And just prior to that, Rod Stewart had come in there and set all attendance records. And then the Alice Cooper Welcome to My Nightmare tour followed after that, and then we broke all those attendance records. So, we played the whole continent from Perth to Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, and all the big venues. So that was a real exciting experience for me as well.
Was it easy for you to adapt to being in a situation of being part of somebody else's band after fronting your own band for so long?
I'm sorry, I lost you there.
That's okay. Was it easy for you to adapt to going back to sort of being in part of somebody else's band after being fronting your own band for so long?
Well, the thing is that after Vanilla Fudge broke up and after the Boomerang thing was over with, I kind of went into almost like a hibernation. I just kind of started writing a lot of tunes myself, and I was away from touring for a good couple of years. So it wasn't until probably around 1975 that I heard Tommy Bolin, who was an incredibly talented guitar player, a solo artist, and was also replaced Richie Blackmore in Deep Purple. And when Tommy left Deep Purple, he was putting a band together, and I was living in California at the time, and I heard about it, and I really was excited to get into his band because he was having a lot of terrific players in there, and I wanted to get back on the road, and I thought that would be a great spot for me. So I went down and played with Tommy down in SIR, and while I was putting the band together, and we ended up playing together. I ended up playing on his last Private Eyes album, which actually went gold after so many years. That band had Michael Walden was in that band, Narda, one of the best drummers I ever played with, and Reggie McBride was the bass player who played with Stevie Wonder, and at the time with a lot of the big acts. And Norma Jean Bell was on horn, and Tommy on guitar, of course, myself on keyboards, and it was really a hot band. We attracted a lot of attention from the Jeff Becks and the John McLaughlins and the Jan Hammers of the world, because it was really like a progressive rock fusion music. So, and actually, that was really like my transition from just Hammy B3 into when I started getting into multi-synthesizers. Mm-hmm. That was also an interesting time in my life. But to answer your question, it was very comfortable for me to actually be in a band with other great players. It really didn't bother me. Some people used to say to me, well, how could you be playing with somebody, just a glorified sideman? But, you're a musician, so if you're a musician, you have to work. If you're an actor, you have to act in a movie if it's not a big hit, so, that's what you do for a living. That's really the bottom line. Absolutely.
Now, there was a solo album of yours in the 70s that I believe never saw the light of day. Would that be one of the major regrets of your career, never getting that album out there?
That solo album was really a big disappointment. That was on Columbia Records, and actually that was produced by Dave Mason, and had a lot of talented players on that effort as well. All I can recall about that is everybody was real excited about the record coming out. They must have put almost $200,000 of a budget into it, and never questioned a thing. During the course of the recording, it was a real positive feel from everybody, and my manager at the time, who was Jason Cooper, his name was, from Jobber Management. At the time, he was managing Ronnie Wood from the Stones, and Dave Mason, and guitar player, great blues guitarist by the name of Les Dudek, who also played on that album back then. So I'm sitting in my house waiting for Jason to call me up. He had a meeting in New York to tell me what the first single was going to be off the record, and he calls me up, and he's like really depressed on it. He says, I got some bad news. I said, what? He said, well, there's not going to be a single coming out. In fact, they're not even going to release your album. So that really blew me away. And I think it was more or less like some kind of a political assassination, because a lot of the acts in his management stable, they were having a lot of problems with on the label. I think that had one thing to do with it. Perhaps the other thing was the new wave sound was starting to become prevalent in the 80s, and the record company was saying that the kind of music I was doing was like a classic rock kind of blues direction, and they didn't feel it was the type of thing that was going to be happening in that marketplace at the time. But it was a very regretful thing, because I put a lot of time and effort into it.
Sure.
But c'est la vie.
Do you know if the tapes are still in existence anywhere?
I'm sorry?
Do you know if the tapes are still in existence anywhere at all?
Yeah, the tapes. I have a copy of. I have a good record of everything I've done in the past. I have quarter track copies of that album from '79.
Right. Any thoughts of ever putting it out yourself?
Well, I might put that together, and I might transfer it to DVD, and maybe I'll, put it up for sale on my website sometime in the future. Which, incidentally, is www.mark-stein.com.
Yep, don't forget that dash in there.
Yeah, so if anybody goes to my website, it's make sure it's mark-stein.com.
You been in the studio?
Yeah, I've been in the studio, and I'm really, really excited about my first solo effort in many years. Been working on it for the last year and a half, and the record it's called White Magic, and the album's going to be coming out in the fall, and it's going to be available for sale, on my website again, www.mark-stein.com. And I got some great players on it. Jimmy Haslip, who's one of the most well-known bass players. He's played on so many sessions around the world. He's in a top band, jazz band called the Yellow Jackets that probably a lot of your listeners are aware of.
Yep.
And Bobby Rondinelli's playing drums on it. He's played with Black Sabbath and Rainbow, and actually he tours with the classic rock band Blue Oyster Cult right now. They made a great rhythm section. And Johnny McCurry's the guitar player on it. He's played with Julian Lennon and Billy Joel, and actually even played with Paul McCartney on some things. He's really a super player. He's on it, and also Jimmy Campanola is one of my favorite saxophone guys, and really played incredible on it. And basically, keyboard-wise, I'm playing Steinway grand piano and back to the basics and Hammond organ. And I'm real excited about the material and the arrangements on it. So I hope a lot of your listeners will check it out, and because it's going to be on my site again, mark-stein.com this fall. Is
most of your original material, or you got some covers?
Yeah, actually, I've it's going to be 10 tracks on it. I've written 7 songs, and I did a rearrangement on the Otis Redding classic, I've Been Loving You Too Long.
Yep.
And I'm really, really excited about the way that came out. And I also did an arrangement on the Benny King standard Stand By Me.
Yep.
And I also did my own blues rock version of America the Beautiful.
Okay.
And the reason behind that is after 9/11, after that horrible thing happened up here. What I did was I put the same band together to sell this on my website, a version of America the Beautiful, and all the proceeds were going to the American Animal Federation that service all the search and rescue dogs. If you were watching all that horror story that was going on in New York, and also at the Pentagon, Washington D.C. You used to see a lot of the search and rescue dogs going in there searching for life or humanity and coming back exhausted and cut up and bleeding, and it really got to me and my wife Patty, and I said, why don't maybe you can do something to raise some money, for the dogs. I mean, obviously billions of dollars were going towards the losses and the people, so I just thought that might be a really appropriate thing to do, and we did a good job. We raised a bunch of money for that cause, and I feel real good about it, and that was the birth of how America the Beautiful came about, and I'm going to be putting it on my album as a bonus track this fall.
Must have been a fantastic feeling to be back in the studio again.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah.
It was really wonderful, absolutely. And it came together like it was meant to come together. All of a sudden, I just had an opportunity to get back in, and I called Jimmy Haslip, an old friend of mine, and I really didn't speak to for years, and one thing led to another, and he's the one that actually put this band together for me for the America the Beautiful sessions, which ultimately led to my whole studio project.
Yeah, I may be wrong, but I think you also mentioned you were putting some finishing touches on some live material as well that you had.
I'm sorry?
I may be wrong, but I think you also mentioned you had some live material from Vanilla Fudge you were working on in the studio as well?
Yes, that is, I'm glad you asked that as well. That's another project I just finished producing. It's Vanilla Fudge Live, and it's called The Real Deal, because it's all original members on it. And these recordings are taken from a tour back in 1987. There was a live show that night in Chicago at the Vic Theater, which is a really famous venue. And what I did is I had the original 2-inch multi-tracks transferred over to. I had them baked, to preserve the integrity of them, and then I had them transferred over to DVD and Pro Tools. And, went in the studio, and I just remixed and reproduced the whole thing, and it came out really, really well. It was a really exciting night, and I think Vanilla Fudge fans are really going to enjoy it because, it's the real thing. Because there are, bands, there's a Vanilla Fudge band touring out there that's not all the original members. And I think for the vintage Fudge fans, I think this will be something they want to have, in their collection. And that also is going to be out on my website in the fall.
Fantastic. I believe you have had some problems in the past with Rhino Records releasing some material under the Vanilla Fudge banner, which didn't involve you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a pretty touchy situation there. This actually is from the same tapes I just talked about. It was from that '87 tour. Basically, one of the members back then had gone in the studio and took it upon himself to remove my vocals and Tim Bogart's bass, from the tapes, and actually put it out on the market as Vanilla Fudge Live, which was at variance with the truth, to use a euphemism. And I did have a problem with Rhino Records, and there was a lawsuit, and to make a long story short, it was settled out of court in my favor, and one of the points in the settlement was I retained ownership of those master tapes, which ultimately, after all these years, I thought it would be a good time to put together and present it, to the fans in the proper way.
Yeah. Well, apart from that unpleasant experience, how do you look back on those 80s reunions now?
Well, in the early 80s, the Vanilla Fudge got back together to do a reunion album. I recall Carmine Appice was doing a show in New York City, I think for UNICEF, and we had a bunch of musicians there to join him on stage, so we all kind of surprised him. I was doing a bunch of commercials in New York at that time, and Tim and Vinny just happened to be in New York, so we all got together that night. I guess that was around 1980, maybe around 81 or 82, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
So we went up on stage, and the magic was still there. I mean, we just played like a couple of, Fudge songs, some of the things we used to do, and the crowd went bonkers. We had a couple of record people in there, and one thing led to another. Before you knew it, we got re-signed to Atlantic Records. And we went on to record an album called Mystery, which we did around 1983. That was produced by Spencer Proffer of Quiet Riot fame.
Oh, yes.
And the interesting story about that is while we were recording the Mystery album at Pasha Studios in L.A., Quiet Riot were also recording at the same time, but they hadn't made it yet. And everybody was talking about the Mystery album was going to be, like a huge record. And it turned out where the record didn't happen, but the Quiet Riot album went on to be a #1 record around the world and the biggest heavy metal album of all time. Sold about 7 or 8 million records, which actually launched the whole heavy metal movement of the 80s again.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
That's an interesting concept right there.
And just as we wind up, Mark, how would you like to see Vanilla Fudge best remembered?
Well, I would hope that Vanilla Fudge left a legacy of a band that was probably one of the first, experimental bands that didn't, influence a lot of the other bands that went on. I know I read excerpts from stories. There wouldn't have been a Yes without Vanilla Fudge, and Deep Purple was certainly heavily influenced by Vanilla Fudge, and certainly even Led Zeppelin, and a lot of other bands that went on. I'd like to be remembered as a band that was probably one of the most exciting live touring bands of its time, which I certainly believe we were. And I appreciate all the fans, the baby boomers, getting into what we were doing at the time, and wish everyone well and long life, and hopefully get into some of the new recordings that I'm doing in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Mark. Best of luck with White Magic. We're going to put this interview to air to coincide with that release, and also the live material as well.
That would be great.